Myanmar is getting these, supposedly getting the cold shoulder from ASEAN. These are the nations of Southeast Asia. They have these summits. Everyone is supposed to attend. They're supposed to discuss things. They're also supposed to keep their noses out of everybody's business. So if any one nation in ASEAN is having an internal political crisis, the other nations are supposed to mind their own business. They're not supposed to get involved. And yet this is being made impossible because of external forces, external to Southeast Asia. The United States is putting pressure on all of the nations of ASEAN to get involved, to violate their own principles of non-interference, put pressure on Myanmar, and get the government of Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy back into power. And part of this pressure includes media in the region, such as the Bangkok Post. So this is an editorial. This is the editorial board of Bangkok Post. Summit snub, a good move. And if you didn't know you were reading the Bangkok Post, you would swear you were reading Reuters or the BBC or CNN or any other Western media outlet promoting US foreign policy. And then it says here, the government in Myanmar, which they're calling a junta, they released more than 5,000 anti-coup protesters, probably as a gesture of compromise. However, this is not enough. This is none of Bangkok Post's business. And then they say what the world and the people of Myanmar need is their commitment to the peace process and restoration of democracy. And there was no democracy in Myanmar, not that I could discern. The election over and over again of the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's political party, was a product of foreign interference, not any sort of democratic process. And I'm going to prove that to you here in just a moment. But the other part, the peace process, there's right now an armed conflict. An armed conflict is a two-way process. So even if the government of Myanmar right now and the military in Myanmar right now wanted peace, could they achieve it? Is there anything that they themselves can do to just unilaterally achieve peace? And the answer is absolutely not. And to prove this, I'm going to show you what is going unreported in Myanmar. So again, this is Myanmar Now. And just to give you a sneak preview, Myanmar Now is funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Virtually all opposition media in Myanmar is funded by the US government and other countries in the West, and also corporate-funded foundations like George Soros's Open Society. So junta municipal and tax offices bombed in Mandalay. The blast targeted 5 locations with unconfirmed reports of injuries. Now, this is opposition media, so they're going to try to downplay the fact that this is terrorism and that innocent people are getting caught up in this. They're getting injured and they're being killed. The Mandalay City Development Office and 4 township tax offices were targeted in bomb attacks. Now, these are civilian targets. Yes, they're government, but they're civil administration. They have nothing to do with the military. And so they're carrying out a campaign of terrorism, and they're hurting innocent people in the process, and they're endangering the lives of innocent people in the process. This is just plain terrorism, and this is being carried out by the opposition. And they have been carrying out violence like this since this whole political crisis began. And you're never going to hear about that. And why aren't you going to hear about that? Because, as I've said, the opposition was created by the US. They have been protected by the US. They are propped up by the US. And even the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar is a US congressman who had worked for the National Democratic Institute. This is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, which has been funding the opposition in Myanmar for decades. And what else about Tom Andrews? He was part of the committee to get Aung San Suu Kyi her Nobel Peace Prize, which we all know is a joke. And he was also a consultant for the National Coalition Government of the Union of Burma, and that's what the exiled government called itself when they were based outside of Washington, D.C. for many, many years. And so do you think that Tom Andrews is going to objectively look at the human rights situation in Myanmar? No. He's going to report on it in a very one-sided way. He's going to inflate every story imaginable about Myanmar's military and government, and he's going to just completely omit any mention of atrocities from the opposition. And so that this is how we get these lopsided reports from the UN, and then it filters through the Western media, who already wasn't going to report on opposition violence, but then they can buttress it with these UN reports by someone who's obviously compromised and should not be a UN special rapporteur to anything, let alone the human rights situation in a country he helped build the opposition up in. Let me show you this article. This is from The World. This is from 2012. The World, this is actually US government sponsored media. Myanmar elections, a changing country and its exiled opponents. And if you come down here, they will tell you about this government, this national coalition government of the Union of Burma. Its headquarters are in a low, gray, unremarkable office building facing the parking lot of the metro stop in Rockville, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. Because it is a client regime of the United States government. They created it, they protected it, they even hosted it and harbored it until the conditions were right to send them back to Myanmar and install them into power. And how do they install them into power? By dumping millions upon millions of dollars through the National Endowment for Democracy into Myanmar's internal political affairs and into their election mechanisms, media, campaigning, everything, just millions upon millions of dollars. And look at this list as I scroll down, how extensive this is. And the link will be in the video description below, and you could read through the programs. And you could ask yourself if the United States would ever tolerate a nation funding even one of these programs, let alone a whole list of programs like this in the United States' internal political landscape. It would never be acceptable. It is a violation of the UN Charter, but this is what the US has been doing to Myanmar for decades. So when people say Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy, they had 2 landslide victories, that's democracy. It isn't democracy. There's more than one way to rig a vote. You don't need to tamper with ballots. You can just dump millions of foreign dollars into the campaign funds of opposition parties. You can pump money into the media, and you could create such a lopsided political environment that the opposition can win no matter what. No one else could even compete with them just because of the sheer amount of resources backing them. And this is what the US has done in Myanmar. They have made a complete joke out of the democratic process. It is an exercise of foreign interference. This is the foreign interference the US always accuses Russia and China of, except this is them just doing it openly. There's also the current national unity government. This is the parallel government that wants to be officially recognized as the government of Myanmar. This is Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy back in exile or in hiding. And if we go to their official website, they have all of the senior members of this fake parallel government. And I want to point out the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is Ta Zin Mar Aung. And guess what? She has her own website on the National Endowment for Democracy's website. She has her own webpage, and they even admit that she had this NED-funded Yangon School of Political Science. And so she had been funded by the US government for years and years. They gave her her own fake NGO, her own fake political school funded by the US government, and they made her a fellow at the NED, and she's also the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the so-called National Unity Government. This is how bad the foreign interference is in Myanmar. This is why Myanmar's military had to oust this government. That doesn't mean you have to like Myanmar's military or their government. It doesn't mean that they're perfect or that they're necessarily the good guys, because, you know, trying to boil everything down to good or bad guys is quite frankly childish. But to think that a military would sit there while a foreign government is running your country through these proxies who had literally been based in Washington, D.C., to think they would sit there and do nothing is absurd. What country would allow this to happen? This is the destruction of their sovereignty. And for Myanmar, a former British colony, this is essentially modern day recolonization. Why would they sit there and allow this to happen? Now, you might not agree with how they've done things. You might not agree with the way they carry out this defense of their country against these foreign interests. But then you have to ask yourself how much of what you think you know about what Myanmar's military is doing is actually true, and how much of it is just the Western media lying about Myanmar like they lie about every other country they target for regime change. So these are all things to keep in mind. I just want to get back to this op-ed in the Bangkok Post. These editorials represent Bangkok Post thoughts about current issues and situations. And when you really think about it, backing the notion that ASEAN should interfere in the internal political affairs of member states, that doesn't benefit anybody in ASEAN. That doesn't benefit any country in ASEAN. That only benefits the United States, that wants to sidestep national sovereignty and interfere in the region and force other countries in the region to do this. When a nation like Thailand is being pressured to meddle in Myanmar's internal political affairs, they can always defer to this principle of ASEAN of non-interference. But now we're starting to see this principle eroded, and we're going to make it easier in the future for the US to pressure countries to violate the non-interference principle and to help push US foreign policy objectives forward in Asia at the expense of everyone's interests in this region. And when we listen to the United States accuse China of bullying nations in the region, this is the United States crossing an entire ocean, the entire Pacific Ocean, to stick its nose into the internal political affairs of every nation in ASEAN, not just Myanmar. The protests in Bangkok are also likewise backed by the National Endowment for Democracy and all of these same forces that we were just talking about. They're doing it in Malaysia. They were trying to do it in Cambodia. They have NED-funded opposition groups trying to gain a foothold in Vietnam. And they were even trying to do so in Laos, but that's pretty much a done deal. And I have people from Indonesia telling me that I need to start digging into things going on there, that the US has been very active, which, I mean, historically, this is very true. And I just did an entire video on Maria Ressa from Rapporteur, this US government-funded fake news outlet in the Philippines, pushing anti-China propaganda and then winning a Nobel Peace Prize for helping the US advance this conflict it's seeking to fight with China. Just totally unreal. So that's an update on what's going on in Myanmar. We see ASEAN getting into some very troubled waters, I guess you could say, violating their own policy of non-interference tentatively. I don't think they have kind of crossed the line too far or irreversibly, but this is very dangerous. And I think they should walk back from this. And part of the problem is that the media in this entire region is completely hijacked by the West and driven by a Western agenda, even though we're talking about media here in the East, in Asia. And it makes no sense to allow your media to be completely controlled by foreign interests, and yet it is. And now we see how that media is shaping minds and advancing agendas that do not actually represent the best interests of the people in this region. Aung San Suu Kyi did not represent the best interests of the people of Myanmar, no matter how many people in Myanmar were convinced of that by the millions upon millions of dollars the US pumped into media to basically brainwash the population. You could convince anyone of anything if you pump enough money into the media. The West and the public in the West, some of the things that they actually believe regarding, the US invasion of Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Libya or this current confrontation the US is engineering with China, when you see how many people in the West have been convinced of things that are obviously not true, obviously not happening, you can understand the power of media and why the US pumping millions into Myanmar's media, why that disfigured the country politically, and why genuinely democratic elections were never possible, not even to begin with. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. This information needs to get out to as many people as possible. The situation in Myanmar is something that no one else is covering, not honestly. And so getting this information out about who is really behind the opposition, why the military thought they needed to oust that government and retake control of their country and protect national sovereignty. This is an important part of the story not being told. Please think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below. All of the links that I referenced are there. There's also ways you can help support my work. To everyone who has been supporting my work, whether it's through Patreon month to month or one-time donations, or even if you're just helping share my work, that is very helpful. I couldn't do this work without that help. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.